discussed in this presentation is current as of the date noted and is for informational purposes only and does not intend to address the financial objectives, situation, or specific needs of any individual investor. Any information is for illustrative purposes only and is not intended to serve as investment, tax, or legal advice, since the availability and effectiveness of any strategy is dependent upon your individual facts and circumstances. Results will vary and no suggestion is made about how any specific solution or strategy will perform in reality. And with that, I'll turn things over to our presenter, Pete Winnett.
Well, thank you, Amelia. Thank you, Ryan. Nice to have those of you that are joining us virtually with us, as well as those that are here in person. First thing on there was to tell a few stories around estate planning. I would say the biggest stories around estate planning are people who don't do the estate planning or don't follow through on what they're supposed to do with it. I've had way too many cases in my experiences of having people go through the motions of creating living trust or wills and then not really taking the next steps to get assets titled right, not to have IRAs and insurance policies with the correct beneficiaries on them. I've had people that have done living trust and then turned around later and because of many years passing, have gone ahead and did a will that was inconsistent with the living trust. It's not a one-time thing. You don't go to an attorney, create a will, create a living trust, put it on the shelf, and you're done. You've got to keep revising it, looking at it, reviewing it, making sure that it's still adequate for the needs and wishes that you have at any point in time. The other thing that I guess I want to stress here a little bit is my experiences of really sometimes just seeing the wrong people be given responsibilities to act as agents. It could be your executor, it could be your trustees, your power of attorney, and you really, I think sometimes there's not enough thought given to that. I've had reluctant trustees, I've had terrible executors that probably never should have been put in those roles in the first place. So again, there was planning, there was tough to implement, but maybe not always the best of planning. And so the stories I have really are about what could have been done differently. And I think for each of you, if you've already got estate planning, please go back and check it. Make sure the right people are still in those positions. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those things. There's a lot of material here that Sarah helped produce and that I have. Sarah has a JD, so she looks at things a little differently than I do. I'm probably going to speak more to some of the practical experiences that I've had, not just with developing the plans, but seeing the outcome of some of those plans. So we're going to start just with some fundamentals of estate planning. And what I want to stress here, and I'm not going to read all of this for you, I'd rather get through some of this and give you opportunities to ask questions, but is to make sure that it's all of your assets that you own align with your overall estate plan. As listed here, a lot of the joint transferable on death, payable on death trust means they're not really part of your probate assets. So too often people go through the process of getting the wills and then they don't really align everything else up the way they should. So a lot of attention has to be given to that. There are many people that on first death, if it's a married couple, there is no probate asset. If everything is jointly titled and there's beneficiaries on everything, transferable on death, a will has no real purpose because there's no probate proceeding that goes on. So that having the right titles, having all of this done to align with the estate documents, the trust and so forth, I think is very important. The titling of intestate simply means that they have no formalized estate plan. So in that case, you are going to be subject to the laws of your state and how things would pass. Sometimes that works out fine. If it's a young married couple and no children, first marriages, that may be exactly what you want. But often it won't be that. And most people want to make sure that they take the efforts to have a will and other possible estate planning documents. We've listed here that the person making the will is known as the testator, and the person who is administering the estate is the executor. But you're going to find that term used. You're also going to find other terminology used as far as estate administrator, so forth. But they essentially all mean the same thing. With the executor, back to my previous point, please consider people that are organized, are people to get things done, that will keep the estate administration moving, will engage with the attorneys the way they need to, so that it just isn't lingering out there and beneficiaries of that estate aren't waiting undue amount of time to get what they expect to have coming. I think that would be my biggest takeaway on that. The letter of last instruction. These go all over. I've seen elaborate ones, almost like notebooks filled with instructions. I've seen half-page handwritten notes. Give it some real serious consideration as to what you want to write down. On the next, this is a good one. Some of these items that are over here are very, very important to people, and a lot of times this information is not available. So a couple in particular that I would really want to mention to you is make sure people know who the attorneys are that you dealt with and your financial advisors. For a lot of people, what happens to their pets is a big friggin' deal. You know, what is going to happen to road food? Who's going to take care of it? And that needs to begin not 6 weeks later, the moment that person is no longer able to do it. So get it written down what your expectation is on that. Location of wills. Don't keep them in your safe deposit box. Get them where somebody can get to them, because that safe deposit box you may have to have an executor appointed to be able to get into the box. And if it's in there, you need the will to be able to take it to the probate court and get the executor appointed. So you can have a catch-22 there if you're not careful. The other thing that's newer is making sure that somebody has written down your login information, your passwords for online banking, even social media accounts, online banking, so they can continue your financial affairs. And the social media is really just to shut that stuff down, so that people aren't somehow still reaching out to you and not realizing that you are with us anymore. All right. Fortunately, today, most people don't have to deal too much with federal estate tax. The exemption amounts, the amount that is not subject to taxation, is historically high and is going up each year adjusted for inflation. Today, a married couple has about $25 million that's exempt from federal estate tax. That's not true for New York State. They have much lower exemption amounts, and more people would fall into owing New York State tax. The other thing to keep in mind here is this current amount of 12.92 million, which again is indexed and is going up every year, those amounts are per person. But the legislation that created those amounts is going to expire at the end of 2025. And the amounts that will be exempted, instead for a married couple being 25, 26 million, that's going to cut in half, unless there's new legislation to either extend that or make it permanent. It's interesting that the legal people seem to have different opinions if that's going to happen or not. You don't want to consider that in October or November of 2025. If you're at any risk of being over 13, 14 million in total assets, you should be doing that planning way before then, unless there is legislation that gets passed. And it does say here, who pays. That will depend on the state laws and New York State. The amounts that are exempted are much lower, and the tax rates are kind of onerous. And we've had one case several years ago. I thought the estate planning was as clean and as complete as could be, but the man had a private investment through basically an investment club. It was worth about $120,000, and he frankly had forgotten about it because there was no income coming from it, and it just sat out there, and it was enough to create New York State tax liability, state tax liability for him. So he had this asset that was thought to be worth about $120,000. He ended up paying something like $80,000 of New York State tax on 120, and when eventually it got sold, it wasn't even worth the $120,000 that it was valued for. So missing these things, not including all of your assets, not having a good inventory can be very, very costly. It does have more impact for states, New York for sure, and often other states as well. Trusts have become popular, particularly revocable. Living trust, it's really can be a surrogate for your will. It is one of the things it does do is it should, if it's properly put together, avoid the probate proceeding. A lot of attorneys will tout that as one of the major benefits of it. Personally, and I don't get that bothered by probate proceedings. As long as you're organized and you follow through with what needs to be done with probate or it's manageable, you can do it. I find just as much value to a living trust for someone who becomes incapacitated because it's a surrogate for a power of attorney. And a lot of times it seems easier to deal with financial institutions, the banks, and so forth, than an actual power of attorney. And there are definite cons or pros to it, and on the con side, it's just there's cost to set those up. I've seen them be way more elaborate than they need to be, and even with that, simplification, I think, is a key. Don't make it more complicated than it needs to be. Again, a lot here. I want to touch on some of these things, give you some things to think about, and we can come back to them. With the living trust, if anybody has those, common mistakes, living trusts are set up, the assets are not switched into the name of the living trust. If you ever have any doubts about that, you need to get some help, make sure you know what's anticipated to be in a living trust. There are living trusts, for example, that will get set up solely for the purpose of holding out-of-state assets. We had clients that, for example, one couple lived in Massachusetts, but they had a California property. There was a California living trust set up just for that property. So it just depends on the circumstances of what needs to be titled to that trust. Your attorney should be advising on that. Your financial advisor should understand that and be able to give you guidance as well. This is an important thing to just understand the differences. The revocable living trusts are the real common ones now that are often referred to as living trust. And that is just a different way of managing your assets, both during life and at death. Your revocable trusts are quite different. You make a gift, it's a completed gift, you don't own it, you can't pull it back anyway, and you can't really dictate how those funds are going to be used. That's spelled out in the trust document that you set up in the beginning. There's a big difference between these, and you have to be careful with your revocable trust, that you're not really losing control and giving away more than is practical for you to do. The terminology, testamentary trust, just means it's a trust that doesn't come into existence until your death, because it's formed under the last testament and will. Testamentary trust, last testament and will. So that is a different type of trust. Very common to see those. A lot of times they're set up for minor children, grandchildren, things like that. Very different than often what is intended by a living trust. And then in the living trust, some of the things that might commonly be in a testamentary trust are incorporated into the living trust. Again, trust that might be set up for minor children, grandchildren, things like that. Healthcare proxy. I'll get on my soapbox here a little bit. This comes back to life experiences, I guess. Please give consideration to who's the right people to do that. You may be asking someone to be in a position that they have to make decisions about how life-saving health care is going to be given to you. And not everybody has the emotional stability to be able to deal with that. And other people don't really know how to go about that. I certainly would want someone, if they were making decisions on my behalf, who, if they had the opportunity and time to be able to do it, would seek out alternative ideals from other medical professionals, maybe get second ideals, talk to other people, gather information, and then make an informed decision. I don't want somebody who says, whatever you say, doc. That's not who I am, that's not what I would want. So think about who the right people are to fill that role. I think when you think about executors and trustees and things like that, they're important. But to me, the only one that's going to impact my life is going to really be the person I name to be my healthcare proxy. So if you're going to really spend your time deciding what's important, I suggest you might want to focus on that a little bit. A living will more commonly today has become known as advanced healthcare directives. I think that's a good way of thinking about it. It's simply that document that says if you have a terminal condition, excuse me. Thank you, Ryan. What matters should be taken to prolong your life? This is where you would say, I want to withhold artificial nutrition, all those things that would prolong your life. I want you to also be careful when you do these to understand what they mean. No artificial hydration, no artificial nutrition means that basically you're going to starve to death. And that's a big thing to tell your medical providers, don't do anything. Just understand what it means. I think it is more applicable as we age. I'm not sure what the right age is to have that definitely in place. I have jokingly told my kids, hey, I'm still young, and I do think of myself that way. keep me alive if you can, you know, and at a certain point, I know my views on that will change. But understand all of the little tidbits that are in those advanced medical directives. Just touch briefly on the powers of attorney. I think they're very important. I've done the power of attorney for my parents when they were aging and really just could not manage things anymore. Allowed me to basically do everything for them that they would have done for themselves, and it's pretty seamless. Without that, I think it would have been much more difficult to get everything in place. My mother died rather suddenly and at a time when my father had Parkinson's and a little bit of cognitive decline, and if we hadn't had those, I think it would have been much more difficult on me filling that role. On the powers of attorney, quick notes here is there's different types: springing, durable, and non-durable. You don't see springing much anymore, I think. I mean, maybe somebody can tell me of some examples, but they used to be much more common. And the idea was they came into existence at the moment you couldn't really do things for yourself, but a lot of times there were legal proceedings around getting those in place, right? So you basically had to get doctor's letters to prove that somebody was, not competent to handle their own affairs, and it could take time. So today you usually see durable powers of attorney. That durable means it is in effect when you're healthy, and it is also in effect when you've got physical problems, cognitive decline, whatever it might be. Non-durable would, if you had the capacity, would stop. And I don't hardly ever see those. And I'm not really sure why somebody would use those. But those are just terminologies again to understand what those are. There's a map here by state of simply who has estate tax, who has inheritance tax, and who has both, which it looks like the only one with both is Maryland. And you will see that there are many, many states who have no estate tax and no inheritance tax. So just be aware of that. We get a lot of calls and clients and others who want to understand the impact if they move, for example, from New York State to Nevada. I mean, what's it mean as far as how much estate tax would they be saving? If you feel you have a sizable estate and you want to know that number, it's not that hard to calculate. I don't know how many people in practice really move simply to save on the estate tax, but the bigger the estate, the more likely I think that is to occur. We certainly hear the stories about a lot of the wealthy people moving out of New York State. That's probably one of the reasons they do it. This is something that I've worked with people on quite a bit, both in my direct professional life and just because it's something I dealt with. I've worked with people that were not clients of us that wanted to support some specific cause. And this is another little bit of a soapbox item for me. There's going to be a lot here about how to give, how to support your charities that are near and dear to you. Don't get too caught up in how initially. I would suggest to you ask the question, why and what? Who is it you want to support? What do you feel passionate about? How do you want that money to benefit? We're here at beautiful JGUA College, and somebody could give money to JGUA College and just leave it as an unrestricted gift. But maybe there's something that is very important to them. Maybe it's the nursing program. Maybe it's the athletics. Really think about how you want your life savings that you're going to be passing along to be used. Sometimes that will dictate some of the other ways that you decide to do it. So it always begins there. I've actually met with people who loved the idea of the tax savings they could accomplish by doing charitable gifts either during life or in death, particularly during life, but really have no idea who the charity should be. I think it's a little backwards, to be very frank with you. Find, if you don't have something, spend the time, figure out who that charity or charity should be. So that's my little soapbox thing, to just make sure that there's a lot of consideration being given to how your monies are used. On here, the last little thing that's bullet pointed here, a lot of the choices that people have come down to how much control you want to have over assets. If you give it away now, or if you maintain control to decide when and how that is used later. So that's another key consideration of doing this. So this is a nice little chart. You can just give the money directly to charities today. We're going to go into details on these a little bit. Donor advised funds have become very popular. You put money into the donor advised fund. You get a tax deduction for that, and you decide later where that money is going to go. You or other people you designate. And that allows for immediate tax deduction, but you still got some control on how the money is used. It's very, very, very popular today. Sometimes people will give money to a community foundation. We'll talk a little bit about that and let them kind of manage things. There are more complex types of charitable trusts that we'll touch on. And finally, probably the most elaborate that we generally would see, and also the most expensive to set up, are the private foundations. QCDs. I am amazed at how often people don't know what these is, including today. When I asked someone who is turning 70 next year if they knew what a qualified charitable distribution was, they did not. And all it is when you are age 70 and a half or older, you're allowed to take monies out of your IRAs and give them to charities, directly to charities, and that money does not count as income to you. And that includes taking the portion of your required minimum distribution and giving some or all of that to charities. And what that does is it decreases your taxable income in your tax and gets that, frankly, out of your tax return. With things today, and this gets a little more complicated, with the income-related monthly adjustment amount, IRMA, that affects things like Medicare, provides for people like me to do what I do, a tremendous planning opportunity to use QCDs. With the higher standard deductions now, a lot of people are getting no tax benefit for QCDs. So I think that's a very important one, and people can do that year after year once they're 70 and a half and have monies in their IRAs. Monetary donations are the ones that we write the checks for. We do it all the time. The long-term stock, if you have highly appreciated stock, gift that instead of cash, get those capital gains away from you so you're not paying tax on that, and you're still going to get a tax deduction for the same amount of the value of that gift. And finally, you can name on life insurance policies, IRAs, beneficiaries to inherit once you die. Let's turn for a moment to the donor advised fund. I just want to, if you're not familiar with these, how they work. Some of the community foundations have them. Companies like Schwab have them and Fidelity. And essentially, you make a irrevocable gift to the fund. You are the donor and the advisor of that fund. Once it's in there, then you advise where that money is to go. And I have yet to see a single case where somebody asked for money to go to a qualified charity that Fidelity or Schwab or the Community Foundation did not follow those wishes. There's some beauties around this. Very commonly, they are used so that somebody can get an immediate and significant tax deduction today because they've given away enough that they're all of a sudden, again, itemizing their deductions, and then they'll spend that down over a period of years. I know of people that have done this. They'll put $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 more in at a time, and then they'll use that to fulfill their obligations to their church, to their college or whatever. And they get the tax deduction, and then begin to use those donations over a period of time. One thing I like to see people do that have adopt next generations, children and grandchildren, is sometimes involve them in decisions around how that money is going to be used, which is pretty easy to do. In those, you don't have to worry about managing the assets. You might pick out an investment approach with somebody like a Schwab or Fidelity, but basically you're letting somebody else take care of that. All the monies that go in there, if you put monies in, you get that tax deduction. The assets that you funded that with are no longer going to be producing taxable income for you, interest, dividends, whatever you might put into that. They're pretty simple. They're easy to set up. They become very popular. Community foundations, I like these best when people have an intent to support their communities in various ways, and they're not always sure the best way of doing it. The community foundation staff can be a tremendous resource to help you come up with ideals to spend your money. So let's just, as an example, say that somebody had a real passion for music, the arts, and maybe also youth. Well, what would be some music programs that would benefit the youth of a community? And they can help you come up with ways of figuring out good ways of using that money. So you make the gift to the community foundation. They set up a fund underneath their auspice of the stuff that they're handling, and you work with them. They take care of really all the administration of it, including the investment of the money. And it says it's less privacy because the foundation publishes reports and people will know that fund exists and how the money is given out. That's a little bit different than if you are doing something with a donor advised fund, where really that's not in the public domain and you have much more control over that. Those are quite popular too, but usually for larger amounts of money. And charitable trust. There's a lot here. I'm not going to get too much into it. This comes down to really understanding your objectives. Very, very popular is people will give appreciated securities to a charitable remainder annuity trust or unit trust. They give appreciated securities. They get a deduction, a partial deduction for what they give. They get income back off from that for a number of years until they die, or until they die if it's given jointly. And at the end, whatever is left over will go back to charity. There's a lot of tax planning on those types of trusts, probably more than we want to get into, unless some of you that are joining us want to cover that in a lot more details. They can be very powerful if investments do well. A lot of times you almost can make back a good chunk of what you have given through the tax benefits of doing that and the annuity payments that get returned to you. And for those fortunate enough to be 100 and more, there's a much higher likelihood of that. Okay. Private foundations, I would suggest, in this day and age, are probably reserved for people who want to give, I'd say the very, very minimum, $1 million, but probably even more than that. There's costs to set them up. There's administrative costs. There's annual tax filings. So there's a lot to it. They are very, very valuable when you really want to create a legacy that your family is going to be involved in. And with that, try to involve the family in the decision-making around how that money is going to be spent. Oddly enough, one of the biggest problems with them is under IRS regulations, you've got to give out some of that trust every year, some of the foundation, the private foundation that is set up. And that number, it's not mathematically correct, but it's around 5%. Sometimes it's hard to find where that money should go. If you live in a small community and you've got a $2 million foundation, you got to give out $100,000 a year. And sometimes I've seen foundation directors struggle with coming up with where that money should go. So there are a lot of considerations that go into having a private foundation. And there is a little bit of tax that's due on it, but it's relatively minor. And again, the biggest part is there's administration. You have to have formal meetings, minutes for those meetings, and keep really good books and records. So it's really only works when you're dealing with a lot of money. Then it might be worthwhile to achieve your objectives. This is meant to summarize. Easiest, just give the money away. If it's cash, appreciated securities, or whatever you want to do. Easiest, it's done, and you don't have to think about it again. Donor advised fund, not a lot different, except instead of giving all the money away now, you're going to decide later. A little bit more complex. Community foundation, usually you have to have a lot more involvement with the community foundation. So that's where the complexity begins to come in. We have people in this room that are experts on community foundations who probably can add to this discussion. You get into the charitable trust again. In my opinion, a lot of it has to do with what your objectives are. There's a lot more tax planning opportunities around the charitable trust. And finally, for a sizable amount of monies, you consider possibly doing a private foundation.